constitutions are anthropocentric, right? They are centered around human interests and they privilege human interests. 98% of all governed sentient beings in the UK are non-human animals.
The yelp of a puppy or a cow resisting being dragged into a slaughterhouse, or a wild animal following its migration pattern, or an animal following a choice test where it, in an embodied way, expresses a preference. Those are political expressions. Those can be reflected through representatives, but even through direct processes as well.
We'll go from a use paradigm, that's how they're considered, to a co-citizen or co-subject or co-fellow earthling.
Raffael, John, good afternoon. How are you both?
I'm well, thank you. Thanks for having us, Jamie.
Thank you, Jamie, for having us. Appreciate it.
It's such a pleasure. So it's great to have you here for the first time, Raffael. I was just saying offline, I feel like I have a slightly parasocial relationship with you because I've listened to you talk so much and attended so many of your events. So it's great to get the chance to have a proper conversation. And John, it's wonderful to have you back on Sentientist Conversations for the second time. You're one of my really early guests in episode 7. And I think out of the over 230 episodes I've done so far, yours is probably one of the most amazing personal philosophical journeys that I've explored. So that was a real privilege to go through that story with you back then. So it's great to have you back.
Oh, thank you. It was fun. Yeah.
Yeah. And you know this already, John. I think you do too, Raffael. But I guess this is a series of conversations about what I think of as the deepest and often most neglected philosophical questions, the real basic stuff like, what's real, what's true, how do we understand this amazing universe we all share? And just as importantly, the ethical questions of what matters and who matters. That question of moral scope is particularly important. And I'm trying to frame sentientism as this really pluralistic, open-minded worldview that answers the what's real and what's true questions with a naturalistic approach. Just says, look, humility, open-mindedness, critical thinking, follow evidence and reason wherever it leads. That's basically it. But where that leads, who knows? We could still have much to disagree over. And on the ethical side, it's quite pluralistic and open-minded, but it does insist that at least every sentient being, every being that can experience, that can feel things, that has their own interests, should matter and should matter seriously. And again, beyond that, it's pretty pluralistic. But I'm very lucky in these conversations to talk to people with really broad variety of different worldviews, some of which match up, some of which don't. Now, my classic conversation, like the one I had with John back in episode 8, is to really take people through their personal story about how they've thought about those deep questions and where they are now and how that ties up with the work they do. But here, I really wanted to focus in on your new book, which zeroes in on two of the big questions we ask here in particular, who matters, how do they matter, but also how can we make a better world in that context? And Animals in the Constitution is amazing piece of work. Congratulations. I'm an amateur in the field, but I loved it. I just finished reading it this morning. And I thought that would be a great story to run through. But before we get on to what you're trying to achieve in the book, how would you two best introduce yourselves to those who don't know of your work already? I don't know, Raffael, if you want to start.
Sure. Yeah. So thanks for listening. Thanks for watching this, everyone. My name is Raffael Fasel. I am an assistant professor in public law at the University of Cambridge and a fellow of Jesus College, and together with a colleague, Sean Butler, I co-founded the Cambridge Centre for Animal Rights Law 6 years ago, and we organised a whole host of different events, including the Talking Animals series that Jamie was sort of implicitly referring to earlier, where we do invite lots of people to come along, talk about animal rights law in a very broad sense. So we have people from all different sorts of disciplines as well, philosophers, economists, anything you can think of, really, scientists we have, and, people talking about animals and their passion for, sort of improving the lot of animals. So yeah, that's what keeps me busy as well.
That's great. Thank you. How about you, John?
Yeah, my name is John Adenitire. I'm a senior lecturer at Queen Mary, University of London. And I mostly work on, two areas that are relevant to this podcast. One, it is, of course, animal rights, but I also work on religious freedom, freedom of conscience. And so these are two themes that I think your audience really relates to. And I'm also co-founder of the Forum on the Center and the Human, which is a interdisciplinary research center at Queen Mary. The main aim of the forum is to question anthropocentrism and to see what ways we can move beyond this human focused inquiries in several areas of intellectual endeavor, especially in the arts and humanities.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you, John. So this book you've written now, I'm obviously biased because anything with sentience in the title I'm bound to like, but it's called Animals and the Constitution Towards Sentience-Based Constitutionalism. So the idea of a constitution is absolutely central. And it echoes with, again, as an amateur, quite a lot of the conversations I'm having here with people like Manisha Decker and Josh Milburn and Jane Kotzman and many others who are looking at political or legal aspects, but also in the wider academic sphere, as you talk about in the book. These topics seem to be bubbling up in all sorts of directions, and addressing constitutions themselves seems to be quite a distinctive contribution that is distinctive in a way from maybe more classical political or legal contributions. So that's one of the reasons I found it fascinating. But the idea of a constitution, I think it's one of those terms that people throw around a lot, but maybe many people don't necessarily understand. So I don't know if that's a good place to start and I'll let you guys decide who wants to pick each question up. What is a constitution and why are they important in our world?
I'm happy to take that one. So a constitution, is quite a multi-layered document that can have many facets, from legal, political, economic, and others. But in essence, the constitutions are the most fundamental legal documents, and they are documents in most countries except the UK and one or two other countries, but they're effectively the sort of apex documents that a legal system has, and that contains its most fundamental principles. Many constitutions entrench these principles, meaning that it is very difficult to amend those principles. And indeed, some constitutions don't even allow the amendment of certain very fundamental things like democracy or human rights, or certain human rights provisions anyway. So we're looking at the most important legal tools, really, that exist if you're interested in doing anything, including improving the lives of animals. And that's why John and I were particularly interested in looking at constitutions. As I mentioned, they intersect with many other things. They intersect with, political philosophy. What should states be doing to improve animals' lives? But most fundamentally, they are legal documents. And we felt like in the legal space, although amazing work has been done on, sort of the legal theory of animal rights, sort of case notes, looking at, the kinds of habeas corpus cases, for instance, that are being brought around the world to have, chimpanzees and elephants and other animals recognized as fundamental rights holders. But in our view, too few people have looked at that most fundamental of legal documents and how it can be rethought in a way that sort of gives due concern, as we call it, to all sentient beings.
So there's a hierarchy of sort of legal structures. They're right at the top, and I guess they're supposed to be the most solid, persistent, hard to change bit of it. So there's sort of if you want to change things deeply, it's an important lever to pull on, I guess. Yeah,
that's precisely right. Yes.
Yeah. In fact, if I may add, to invert your analogy, Jamie, rather than seeing the Constitution as the top, I actually prefer to see as the foundation, right, on which everything in the legal system is built. And just to add something to what Raffael said, yes, of course, constitutions in most parts of the world are documents. But one other thing that we do in the book is really to look at constitutional principles, which are not always documented in the straightforward way, but sometimes in some jurisdictions are implied principles that, such as democracy, the rule of law, of course, protection of fundamental rights, the principle of proportionality. But some of these constitutional principles that we see are not even explicitly mentioned in some constitutions, but they nevertheless are so core, so important to how a constitutional state goes about its work, that we thought it was very important to relate it to the issue of animals.
So there's a lot of variety between different constitutions, but there are some consistent themes running through them that you've addressed in the book. And one of the tricky things, if you're talking about something that is foundational or at the apex, or it's the most important element of the building, if you like, is okay. So what is that foundation itself built on? And when you look at constitutions around the world today, what are they? What's their axiom? What's the root? What's the thing that they're trying to achieve, or their own intrinsic justification? If they're the foundation, if you like, what do they tend to be based on? And I guess we can get into why that might be a problem.
There's a great plurality, but if you boil it down to its essence, you'll find that constitutions are anthropocentric, right? They are centered around human interests, and they privilege human interests. If you're looking at, democratic constitutions, then you have a broader range of human interests that are, taken into account. If you look at, more monarchical systems, then it's a smaller range of human interests that are, sort of at the forefront. But regardless of which type of constitution you look at, they are human-centric documents, human-centric practices at the end of the day. And in the book, we look at different ways in which this anthropocentrism manifests itself. For instance, by excluding all non-human animals from fundamental rights, by excluding all non-humans from, the protections of democracy. Animals aren't considered part of the people that get to, have their interests represented in, say, a parliament. And there are many other ways in which legal systems, more broadly, are very much human-centric. For instance, there are lots of concepts that float around, like legal personhood, for instance, that although, open to being extended to non-human entities in principle, tend to only be sort of applied to human beings, or at best to corporations that ultimately serve human interests, right? What we're finding too in all constitutions around the world really is the fact that animals are property, or what's sometimes called property plus, right? By which is meant, there's some legal systems that don't in a strict sense treat animals as ownable things, or at least they claim that animals are no longer just mere things like a table or a laptop or a bike or a book, but they have some better status. But as I said earlier, they're not recognized as legal persons either. So very often it just comes down to, well, effectively, they're still being treated as things with some very minimal welfare protections at best. So there are many ways in which constitutions are anthropocentric, and that poses, massive problems for animals.
And what is it about humans that constitutions point at to say this is why they should be considered and looked after in the first place? What are the sort of concepts about humans that constitutions point to?
So, I mean, if the question is, why are constitutions so anthropocentric, then there's a pretty good reason for it. Constitutions are made by humans, right? But and some will say, and therefore it makes no sense to extend concepts like, constitutionalism to animals in the first place, because ultimately this is a human endeavor. So why shouldn't it just, only extend to human beings? There's some intuitive plausibility to that, but we rebut it.
Because maybe that's one of the things I'm getting at, is that there's one idea about constitutions, which is they're there for the benefit of those who can participate. And I think that's partly what you're challenging.
I think that's right, or at least we're trying to say participation needs to be understood much more broadly, right? Because there's a very narrow way in which you can approach constitutions, which is, well, those who are involved in making the constitutions, say those who can, vote on a constitutional referendum to amend the constitution or create a new constitution, the Constitution is supposed to serve their interest because they're the makers, if you like, of the Constitution, or the changers later on if you already have an existing Constitution. Now, the problem with this, as we argue in the book, is that's much too narrow, because it excludes a whole range of human beings who never have the ability to participate in constitution making and changing, moments, either because, maybe they live in a system like the United States that just, doesn't have amendments to the Constitution very often at all. So you may just never have the chance. And even if you do have the chance, maybe you lack the abilities. Maybe you don't actually have, the capacity to exercise a right to vote, right? Because you're suffering, say, from, some severe mental, disability, or maybe you're way too young. I have two babies at home that, are not able to participate in a constitution making process. And to exclude them from the scope of protection of constitutions is very problematic, as we argue in the book, because they are still governed by the constitutional framework because of the reasons that we've mentioned. They're the apex documents, the most fundamental documents. So what they say influences everything, including legislation, regulations that affect babies, people with severe mental disabilities, and that's, of course, what the book is about, animals too. So just because they can't participate in that constitution-making process in the narrow sense doesn't mean that they're not governed by constitutions. In fact, they're governed much more intrusively than many human beings, or most human beings are, arguably, and therefore we should give due concern to their interests.
Yeah, thank you. And you open, and you also close the book with referring to Pericles boasting about his democracy and how we look back on that now. And I thought that was a really interesting way into explaining to people, why there's a problem here that you call the legitimacy gap. I don't know if you wanted to sort of just quickly run through that, how you tell that story and how you relate it to, the representation of beings in the UK as an example.
Yeah, so the idea there basically is to say, look, let's look at what was once considered a paradigmatic example of democracy, Athenian democracy.
Some people still think it is now, if you're on the internet.
You can find anything on the internet these days.
Oh, yeah.
And again, I guess there's something plausible to it. It was maybe the first system, arguably, that had a sort of direct involvement of citizens in the democratic process. And, I don't want to sort of underestimate the importance of that. But what we show there is that, well, if you look closely, only around 12% of people living in Athens at the time were indeed included in this process, right? Because if you were a woman, if you were a slave, if you were even a man who was not old enough, or for some other sort of reasons were excluded from the process, you were not a citizen that counted for sort of democratic purposes. You were not part of the demos, right? And what we want to do with this is say, look, there's sometimes models of democracy that we have, maybe, UK democracy, or I don't know, German democracy, or any other sort of system you want to think as an example, a sort of a paradigmatic example that's doing things really well. If you take a step back, you may find that there's some real legitimacy problems in that these documents, these constitutions, these practices apply to a whole lot of beings that don't have a say in, what these documents look, what the rules look like effectively. And what we do is we run some numbers in the UK context, and we try to show how, if you count all the sentient beings, and this is a very conservative estimate, I should say, you will find that 98% of all governed sentient beings in the UK are non-human animals, right? It's only 2% that are actually human sort of sentient beings. And yet, as we just said, the UK Constitution, and you can sort of extrapolate that to any other sort of constitution as well, apply that to other constitutions, are entirely anthropocentric, only serve human interests. So they exclude 98%. So it's even worse than the Athenian sort of democracy, you could say, which sort of, excluded, 88%. And then, of course, all the sentient animals as well. So we try to sort of say there's a gap here that we need to address.
Yeah. And I think that's a fascinating way of doing it, because it's so easy to look back into history and to judge and to criticize and say, look how narrow, look how problematic, look at And it's really useful to imagine future generations looking back at us now and having that freshness of mind to drive change forward more strongly too. Although I do find it frustrating that there seems to be a trope amongst public intellectuals today to say future generations will condemn us for X while those people still do X. But let's put that to one side. I think it's a really powerful idea. Right? It's a really powerful way of thinking to take us out of our own current context and to think more in a utopian and a more principled way. And I guess what you're trying to aim for in the book, you say, is realistically utopian. I think the ideas here are deeply radical, and we'll come to some of the implications later. But you do want it to be realistically utopian. This isn't a work of pure ideal theory. This is something pragmatic too. And as you've already explained there, or at least hinted, one of the core things you're trying to do is make constitutions much more inclusive, both to include what you describe as non-paradigmatic humans, but also non-human animals and sentient beings too. So under your vision of new sentientist constitutionalism, why do sentient beings get included, and who do you think that includes, and how do we handle the fuzzy boundaries of who gets included in this new expanded scope?
Yeah, this is a very interesting question. In the book, we try to be open-minded, just like you were saying earlier in the introduction, Jamie. We think that at the minimum, sentient beings should be included within the constitutional circle, so to speak. And by sentient beings, we mean beings that have valence experiences. So that objective experiences that are either bad or good. And, but we know that there are many other moral frameworks out there. In fact, Raffael and I are working on another book, which is on the rights of robot rights of nature, and animal rights. And so we are acutely aware that others also include, for example, nature within the moral circle, or elements of nature, because perhaps they have cosmological worldview, a particularly theistic worldview that treats certain elements of nature, like rivers, as similar to human beings, right? So in the book, we don't want to outright reject these alternatives, but we say at the minimum, right, a constitution as to pay due concern to sentient beings.
Yeah, thank you. And is that essentially because, as you've described, a sentient being in a way can be impacted in a way that matters to them? Like, things can go well or badly for them. That's what being governed by something means, is you can be impacted and therefore you should be included. Is it that simple as a basis?
Absolutely. We don't delve too much into the moral theories, but our view is that, sentient beings are inherently valuable. They experience their own well-being. Life can go better or worse for them. So at a minimum, they have their own interest, and their interests matter for them, not just for the purposes of others. So that's I think at a minimum why we include sentient beings. Of course, we also acknowledge that there is a huge debate about who counts as a sentient beings, even within the animal kingdom, right? So, of course, I think one of your guests in one of these Sentientism podcasts recently was Jeff Sebo, and he's been writing on insects, whether insects or certain insects also should be counted as sentient beings, and there is some debate on this. And so, let's say that insects actually count, at least some insects. So that's the back of the envelope calculation that we did in relation to the UK does not include insects as possible sentient beings. So the legitimacy gap would even expand more radically, right, if we were to consider them. But in any event, that's the constitutional subject that we focus on sentient beings.
Yeah. So the scope of the constitutionalism you're defining doesn't draw boundaries around particular types of beings or species or maybe even substrates of beings. It's the capacity for sentience that means you count whatever you are and whoever you are. That's roughly at least
in principle. However, as far as we know, the beings today that we can be confident sentient are animals, including human and including human animals as well. So that's why the focus of the book is on our current knowledge. Yeah.
I mean, there's one caveat to this, Jamie. So it's true that, as John said, all sentient beings are, in principle, our sort of baseline. But what the book does, it focuses on only those sentient beings that are governed by a constitution. And we do indeed say that if a constitution's legitimacy was based on how it sort of catered for all sentient beings, including those that it doesn't necessarily govern, then that would be sort of too wide-ranging. It would be sort of not sufficiently practicable, really. So we focus on sentient beings that are governed. And by governed, we mean that those exercising public powers, so state officials broadly, have effective control over the life, the body, or the habitat of a given sentient being, right? So in the book we talk about examples. Maybe they're just the most obvious examples, but you could find those examples in smaller nations too. We talk, for instance, of Siberia, right, which is so vast that the Russian state, there's no chance they'll have effective control over, I don't know, a sort of a wild species somewhere in Siberia, right? And therefore, the Russian state's legitimacy would not depend on that, given wild, individual or population or whatever you're dealing with. So we're casting the net slightly less widely, right? Because we want it to be, a realistically utopian vision, as you said. There's an element of realism here where we felt that being governed is actually crucial and not everyone is actually governed.
Yeah, but it's still quite a reasonably broad definition of governed. It's not saying, for example, just non-human animals within our homes or factories or labs. It would extend out to wild animals where, those habitats are governed effectively by the bodies that are beholden to the Constitution. So it's still quite broad in that sense.
Precisely, yes. And we ultimately don't, sort of take a very sort of clear stance on, who's included, who is not included. We want to leave it open intentionally because we do, appreciate that there is ongoing debate over the extent to which wild animals can even truly be considered wild in, sort of an age of, the climate catastrophe where humans have, such a vast impact on any living entity, really. And there's, folks like Martha Nussbaum who argue really that there's no such thing anymore as an animal in the wild. We stay a bit non-committal as far as this goes, but we think that probably there are still lots of beings that are not governed in the sense that we require. But as you say, Jamie, that still leaves, plenty of animals that normally are never included in, sort of what it takes for a constitution to be legitimate.
Yeah. And could you say that's analogous to even a sort of a human-centered national constitution, which might have some regard for global humanity through international aid and foreign policy and so on, but it wouldn't be directly beholden to non-citizens? Is there some sort of analogy there about, we're concentrating on our jurisdiction primarily, the things we can control, and the other stuff is a bit more second order? Or
I think that's correct, with one small proviso. So because we focus on effective control, it's basically a concept that we're taking from international law, where if you're thinking of countries that occupy another country, they can have effective control over the occupied territory without those people being citizens of the occupying country, right? So in our framework, the occupied animals, if we want to use that, terminology, would be governed even though they're not sort of citizens, if you will, or sort of the analogy of citizenship will break down in that context. But normally, yes, we do sort of approach things from a nation state-centric point of view. And that's because it ties in with, what we mentioned about the sort of the realistic bit of utopianism, because it's still nation states really that, if you will, call the shots, on the international plane. And therefore we think they're the most relevant sort of entities to be focusing on.
Yeah. Thank you. So that's set the scene beautifully in terms of constitutionalism and your challenge to it and the vision for where constitutionalism could go. And then, as you mentioned, you talk through some different constitutional themes that will be really interesting to run through. And the first of those really is about this question of, okay, what does this practically, matter for these beings, and what sort of protections do the constitutions provide? Because I think both in legal and political circles, but even in personal ethics, we're very familiar with this sort of messy space of saying you care, but not really doing anything about it, or giving someone a tokenistic sort of protection, which doesn't really help them very much, or much more serious protections that really do respect the individual and their interests and so on. And you address this in thinking about the questions of fundamental rights. But maybe as a good way into that, it would be good to just give us a quick survey of the things that are already being done around the world in constitutionalism and politics and law that are potentially positive moves for animals, even if they don't get anywhere near the vision you're laying out. So I don't know if it's easy to summarize what sort of constitutional accommodations or tweaks you've seen to date that do go beyond the human.
Yeah, there are some, not many. As you say, Jeremy, they don't go as far as we would want in our realistic utopia. So there are a handful of states and quasi-states like the EU have constitutional recognitions of animals, some kind of constitutional protection for animals explicitly in their documents. So they would have some constitutional clauses that say animals need to be protected, or the dignity of animals, like in Switzerland, has to be recognized, or the state has a mandate to legislate animal welfare laws, animal protection laws to that extent. So there are some existing provisions which are of a welfarist type at the constitutional level. There is also a more recent trend, some recognition of some fundamental rights at the constitutional level. Some of them very recent, and they have been happening through the rights of nature paradigm. So some constitutions, like in Ecuador and some other Latin American countries, recognize nature as a subject of rights, grants nature its constituent part certain rights, and animals, because they're considered part of nature, sometimes benefit from that protection. So in Ecuador, for example, especially wild animals have been recognized as having constitutional rights, such as the right not to be hunted or not to be taken away from their natural habitats. Okay, but this is a quite recent development. Of course, there were some precedents. For example, in India, there was some discussion at a constitutional level whether some animals had certain fundamental rights. There's still some ongoing debate whether that was a natural thing or whether there was some, let's say, maybe a mumbled set of choices of words. It's still not clear. But for example, some Indian courts recognize right for birds to fly based on some constitutional provisions. So there is something out there in some jurisdictions, but we think it doesn't go far enough. And the proposal.
And before you come on to the proposal, a tangent. Personally, I get quite frustrated when I see a lot of progress on rights for nature, because I feel this dissonance that governments and people would be totally comfortable granting rights to a river or a rock or a tree or an ecosystem, but can't bring themselves to grant rights to obviously sentient beings like fishes and pigs and So I feel this sort of dissonance, like what the hell is going on? How could you get there but neglect these beings? But what you're implying is actually that can be a really positive aspect for non-human sentient animals as well, because they can be productively drawn into the rights for nature question. How do you see that dynamic? Am I being a bit too frustrated and snarky there? Is there a real positive option for non-human animals in rights for nature initiatives?
I think you're right to highlight the tensions, Jamie, that exist in rights of nature frameworks. Because first of all, there's a whole variety of different rights of nature sort of developments. They're usually lumped under, rights of nature, but they're in fact very different. And you have to look at each and every example to see exactly what's going on, who's being protected, is this really a right or not, and who's the holder of the right, and does it actually serve more a human community than the natural entity as such? So there's a whole variety of different things going on. But if we zoom out, I think what you can see, certainly if you're interested in animals, is that there's a tension, right? On the one hand, you'd think that protecting animals and nature, that sort of goes hand in hand because animals are part of nature. The problem with right of nature, if you're an animal rights thinker, is that a lot of right of nature developments are very much focused on a collective entity, right? Say an ecosystem of a given river, or a sort of part of a mountain. If you're an individual animal that contributes to that ecosystem, great, you might benefit from the rights of nature. If, on the other hand, you're an animal that's considered invasive and you're considered to be harmful to that ecosystem, then things don't look quite as bright for you. So because rights of nature tends to be focused on collective entities, not individual entities, individuals can lose out big time. And so it's not necessarily a sort of harmonious, partnership between rights of nature and animal rights. And just to mention the example that, John flagged in Ecuador. So this was a case called Estrelita, where a woolly monkey, so a wild species or an individual sort of member of a wild species, was kept as a pet. And the Constitutional Court found that, yes, wild animals are part of nature, so therefore they're protected through the rights of nature granted in the Constitution. But with regard to domesticated animals, they came to a very different conclusion and effectively said, oh, it's still fine to, go on to raise and kill animals for food because they're not wild animals, they're domesticated animals. So, if anything, that judgment, sort of gives with one hand and takes away with the other, because it's now sort of enshrined, if you will, in a constitutional court ruling that domesticated animals, it's fine for them to be raised and slaughtered and eaten, right? And indeed many other purposes too. So it's a double-edged sword.
Yeah, thank you. So and John, after I interrupted you, I'll let you come back to what your proposal is, because I think it ties together well. Because one of my difficulties with the rights of nature, I mean, if I see rights just as a tool for protecting things that need to be protected, and environmental destruction, biodiversity loss, polluting a river, these are generally bad things for the sentient being. So let's use rights to protect the nature. I can sort of see that, right? But the ultimate underpinning of those rights, for me, comes back to the interests of the sentient beings that are ultimately impacted. Whereas if you grant rights to a river intrinsically as some sort of being, I'm not sure what that right is ultimately grounded in, because I don't think the river has any interests in their own right. And that's, I guess, what leads me back into sentience and so on. So what's your proposal, John, under this constitutional focus? I guess firstly, why rights? Secondly, which rights? And also, what are those rights, determined by? What are they built on? Yeah.
Mm. So many interesting questions. Let me
sorry.
No problem. Let me just put a little proviso based on what you said, your skepticism about rights of nature. Maybe one way to overcome, I'm sure it will not be satisfactory to you because of your naturalistic worldview, and also to me because of my naturalistic worldview, is that under some cosmologies, rivers, other components of nature, actually sentient beings. They have feelings, and they're understood to be deities or quasi-deities.
Which in that context is actually part of a sentiocentric moral stance. It's just that you and I might disagree with the attribution of sentience in that case. Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. So maybe that could explain why you could be sympathetic in some way, in indirect way towards some of that. But to go back to our proposal, in a chapter in the book, the fundamental rights chapter, we argue that, well, existing constitutional rights should be extended to all sentient animals. And that we don't necessarily, though sometimes we may do, we don't necessarily need a different Bill of Rights from bills of human rights to protect the interests of sentient animals, because we share many of the same interests and capacities, though of course some are exclusive to certain species. Okay, but that there are many interests and many capacities that are shared, and that there are certain features of the practice of fundamental rights that actually can help us envision this idealistic, utopic extension of fundamental rights. And one of them is exactly this expansion of who counts as a subject of rights, of constitutional rights. And when Raffael was discussing Athenian democracy, some of that is very close to, for example, the history of the United States, and who counted as a constitutional rights holder. So it was first white men that owned property, and then over a course of time, not property owning men, white men, some kind of not white men, some women, and et cetera, were brought into this circle of rights holders. So we think that, this, what we call the progressive expansionism of rights holders in the practice of fundamental rights, is one of those things that we use to tie in the ideal, the utopic, to the realism, right? Because it's based on the history of fundamental rights, that over the course of history they have been expanded.
And none of those expansions required a separate Bill of Rights or a different set of rights. It was just bringing more beings into scope. Yeah.
Absolutely. But that's not to say that we share exactly all the same interests or capacities. So one example that we put in the book is that it may be that certain rights may be interpreted more expansively for certain categories of rights holders, such as animals, than for humans. One example is there are certain kinds of aquatic animals like salmon that have a vital interest in living without borders, right? Moving freely across borders, because they have these migratory patterns that they need to be able to move freely across borders. Otherwise, they wouldn't be able to survive. So humans don't necessarily have, at least to that extent, that basic interests. Of course, there are situations where staying within a particular territory is not, you wouldn't be able to survive because there's famine, there's war, or whatever. But this is a kind of different circumstance. So there are instances where, even though we all benefit from the same fundamental rights, this doesn't mean necessarily that all rights holders have exactly the same rights. But this is, again, grounded in existing, as a human rights practice. Say, potentially everyone has the right to vote, or potentially in a constitution, some have a right to abortion, but not every single person or rights holder will be able to use that right. So that chapter really offers reasons to think of this extension, why we should extend fundamental rights, have the same Bill of Rights for humans and animals, with some exceptions, of course.
Yeah. And I find that approach fascinating because some do suggest, separate bills of rights for animals or separate initiatives. And I can see the pull of that because they want to craft it around, maybe the needs and interests of non-human animals in a particular way. But I'm also very nervous that it opens the door for ethical inconsistency and, slippage back into instrumentalization and so on. And, of course, humans have the serious rights, and then non-human animals have these things we're calling rights, but aren't quite so serious. So I just, in terms of intellectual clarity and cleanliness, but also just in ethical coherence, I much prefer the idea of having an integrated set. And I think I mentioned to you, John, I did this sort of amateur thought experiment a long while ago of taking Universal Declaration of Human Rights and basically just rewriting it as the Universal Declaration of Sentient Rights. And to be honest, it probably needs a proper rewrite, but it was a bit more than a find replace, but it wasn't that much more. And I was really surprised at how easy it was because, like you say, of course, there are some rights where you think, okay, that clearly isn't relevant to most non-human animals, but it doesn't matter. It can still be in this coherent rights statement. There were others where you've initially thought, clearly that's not relevant to non-human animals. But then when you think a bit deeper, you're like, hold on, maybe it could be right to education or, various other things. You can imagine there are different forms of education that happen within non-human animal families. And you're like, oh my, there's something really interesting there actually about even some of these rights may actually even apply. But then when you get to the really most basic ones for humans, if you said to humans, right, what are the most important things for you to have protected in terms of rights? Those seem to be the ones that were most generously and most broadly shared across sentientity as well. And I guess, is that partly a reflection of why you focused mostly on fundamental rights as something you want your constitutionalism to protect? So where do you zero in on the highest priority rights that you think are most relevant and most important for constitutionalism to protect?
Yeah, so in the book, we have limited words, limited energy as well as scholars. So,
and you're writing a new book already too, so got to move on.
So in the book, we do focus on 3 fundamental rights: right to life, right to freedom, and right to bodily and mental integrity, otherwise known as the right against torture and degrading treatment. But as we say in that chapter, we could have focused on several other rights. And in fact, at some point, we had several other rights that we had considered, but we had to cut down this. In fact, one right that I was particularly interested in is freedom of thought or freedom of conscience that could also be applied to animals, at least some animals in some circumstances. So, but of course, we wanted to make the distinction between fundamental rights that protect basic interests and, as Raffael sometimes puts it, so let him talk about it, like a right to the belly rub, which is a little different in terms of.
You can probably see Luna down here. She's
claiming the right for a belly rub.
Yeah, she would put in a vote for that. Yeah.
Yeah. So we just had to make a differentiation, and actually we were aided in this by the existing human rights practice, because human rights already delineates to a large extent what rights are considered fundamental. The existing civil, political, social, economic rights. Of course, we couldn't go through the entire list, but perhaps one day there is some merit to maybe writing another book on which exact rights to be accorded to be extended to animals.
Yeah, thank you. Now, one of the things I think you take a pretty strong view on is avoiding this risk of slippage or tokenism or a sort of drift back into anthropocentrism, which I think we see in so many spaces when it comes to non-human animal ethics. And there's at least a couple of areas where I think you work hard to draw a clear line. I mean, one is by making sure this is an integrated rights stance. There isn't a separate document you look at for non-human animals that, might weaken the temptations, but you do explicitly have a right to life, and you talk quite strongly about non-instrumentalization as a sort of principle that runs through this as well, which I think does close the door quite firmly to some other approaches, which would say, look, we want to have some sort of consideration for non-human animals, but we're going to leave the door open for us to use them, exploit them, kill them, in various ways. So one example is there's this statement of the 5 freedoms that's often talked about in the context of animal agriculture. And it talks about freedom from distress and pain and discomfort. It talks about the freedom to express natural behaviors. It feels quite progressive and generous in a sense, because from a naive reading of those 5 freedoms, I don't think you could farm animals and be compliant. But actually, it's interpreted in a way that enables animal agriculture. It comes out of that context. It's justifying and framing in the context of use. So there is this sort of insidious slippage, or this, starting from a good intent and then ending up back where we started, that I think your approach, it doesn't fall foul of. Well, when you're thinking about the right to life and that instrumentalization question, what is it? Just a pragmatic reaction to that risk, or what's the philosophical underpinning for why you think those are important constitutional protections for non-human animals?
I think it takes us back to, the discussion we had earlier about sentience and why sentience, right? If you accept that sentient beings have intrinsic moral worth, then you need to, in our view, adopt a rights-based framework, a deontological framework that does not allow the interests, or certainly the basic interests of these animals, to be traded off against, sort of human interest or the interest of whatever the sort of, the common good or whatever you want to call it, without certain, very strict limits to it, right? If you think of, Nozick, for instance, he encapsulated this as, this utilitarianism for animals and Kantianism for people, right? And we think it should be Kantianism for animals as well, because really only Kantianism, or sort of the non-instrumentalization principle, as John calls it in the book, takes seriously the fact that sentient beings have intrinsic moral value. They have interests that are worth protecting for their own sakes, regardless of what you might achieve by violating these interests. And really the whole, sort of human rights framework, the theory and practice of human rights, that certainly the chapter on fundamental rights in the book is inspired by, but the whole book indeed is inspired by, is based on a rejection of the idea that, we can approach humans in this utilitarian way where, it's fine to torture someone as long as you can find the person who's hit the bomb, or, whatever sort of scenario you can conjure up. That is something you can do under human rights law. You can never torture someone, whatever the gains may be, that you would get from torturing them. And we think animals should be approached in the same way because of sentience.
Yeah, thank you. And I've had you talk about Peter Singer's philosophy in the book too, and I've been lucky enough to interview him twice, and we explored this topic. And he seems, undecided about the best way forward. But I guess what we explored here was a distinction between caring about the sentience of beings as a almost independent property, right? So yes, you're a being, but what matters about you is your sentience. And if that sentience measured on some sort of scale from outside, goes up, that's a good thing. If it goes down, that's a bad thing. But if you're killed painlessly, the scale doesn't move up or down. So the sentience bucket, we don't really care. So there's that distinction between caring about the sentience of a sentient being and caring about the sentient being in their own right and their perspective, their interests, their values, their aspirations. And it feels to me like that's like part of the dynamic here. It's probably not technically exactly, utilitarian versus Kantian, but there's something about that, respecting the individual being because they are a being intrinsically.
Yeah, actually, maybe to add to what you have been saying, and I'm sure Raffael will agree, we write within the liberal tradition, right? So maybe this really explains why we focus on the individual, right? One important part of the liberal tradition is this individualism, right? The worship or the value of the individual, not of just their capacities or their interests or whatever, but the individual is the basic unit of political concern and moral concern. And, we have been inspired by a lot of critical scholarship like that of Manisha Dika, who are rightly very critical of the history of liberalism, of how liberalism has worked in practice. And we take that on board very much throughout the book. But nevertheless, we identify with this tradition, and part of this tradition is this endowing of value to the individual and the bestowing of rights to the individual to protect them as an entity. So definitely, we are not consequentialists or utilitarians in the Peter Singer way.
Yeah, thank you. And I think that I can't speak for Manisha, although I had a fascinating conversation with her, but I think part of the criticism of liberalism is because of its history of only picking out a certain subset of powerful individuals to privilege in that liberalism. And your version of liberalism is addressing exactly that problem and saying, everybody who should be counted as a valid individual with their own interests and their perspectives should count. And that, in a sense, maybe fixes liberalism for you in the same way as it fixes constitutionalism. And I know Manisha and others will still challenge that and say that they want to focus on, there are some aspects of collectives or systemic or relational interactions that would still challenge that. But I think exactly what you're doing addresses that core challenge to liberalism, which is making sure that everybody gets counted, that everybody valid gets counted as an individual. Yeah.
Yes, and it's a good point that you're raising, because it's something we sort of grappled with when writing the case for sentience-based constitutionalism, i.e. what's, chapter 2 in the book. And we look at, the critical tradition, and we say, well, are we maybe being too anthropocentric, by still using, concepts like constitutionalism and liberalism, as John says, and rights, and why don't we do away with it altogether and, build something new from scratch? And I think there's sort of two answers we give to that challenge. The first one is that I think it's a category error to think that just because the history of something is flawed, that the thing in itself is necessarily flawed too, right? Because as John's mentioned, this progressive expansionism, as much as it is something that we need to make sure we don't, go back on and, don't deprive people of rights that, have gained rights, and all of this is important, but it's something that has been happening, and, sort of the right to vote has been extended to a larger range of people. So the right to vote isn't inherently flawed as we look at it, nor are concepts like constitutionalism and democracy and rights more broadly. It's just that they haven't been interpreted inclusively enough, right? And the second worry that I have with the critical sort of animal studies approach is a strategic one. I'm really not sure that revolution is necessarily the better way to go than reform, right? Not least because we don't really know if there's a better alternative out there and whether it will work, and B, maybe because of sort of path dependency, but we're kind of stuck with the tools we have right now. So yes, we can approach a judge and say to them, please extend to animals status XY that I have developed and come up with and think it's amazing. And perhaps it is from an idealistic point of view, but it's not a concept that the judges use to at all. Maybe they don't even know what it means. Whereas if you go to them and say, legal personhood, you know what legal personhood is. You've already given it to a company, so might as well give it to this inanimate entity. So from that point of view too, we tend to be more realistic, I guess, than utopian, but there's different pros and cons at the end of the day.
Yeah, thank you. So the idea of rights and fundamental rights is central, of course, and it's very clear now who those would be extended to under your vision of constitutionalism. But of course, rights are just the starting point. There's a caricature of rights approaches that, people are drawn to rights approach because of their clarity and because they really defend individuals more strongly than maybe your utilitarian approach might do. So people are drawn to it because it feels more robust protection for us and for other beings. But the caricature-ish criticism of rights is that they're then inflexible and uncompromising and can lead to some extremely unintuitive situations when you do have conflicts. So that brings me on to, I guess, the second big theme of your work, which is about proportionality, where you're talking about, okay, what do we do when there are trade-offs and conflicts, and where different beings do have conflicting interests or maybe even conflicting rights, and how do we work that through? Because my understanding of a rights approach is it absolutely does allow space for dealing with that stuff. It doesn't just sort of shut the door and say, I'm sorry, rights can never be violated. Right? Sometimes it's the right thing to do to violate someone's rights. What's your approach to that?
Yeah, indeed. That was the subject of the proportionality chapter, which I think builds on the realization that with some very limited exceptions, like the right to torture, rights are not absolute. And there are sometimes trade-offs that have to be, or compromises that have to be made, and that sometimes it is justified to infringe someone's right. However, we have to make sure that we are not slipping from the Kantianism, right? Or this inherent value of recognizing the inherent value of sentient beings to a situation just where anything goes as long as the consequences are worth it, right? Because we still have to value the individual. It's still a rights-based framework. So much of that, the discussion in that chapter is to make sure that whenever there is a trade-off, there is a balancing to be made, then nevertheless we keep our eyes fixed on the inherent value of all subjects. And in most of that chapter, we use this case study, which some of your listeners, some of your audience may be familiar with. In Afghanistan, when the U.S. and the U.S. allies withdrew from Afghanistan, many humans were trying to flee the country through flights, and apparently there was one flight, a private flight, that was used to evacuate some animals, and the part of the media frenzy and furor was that this flight could have perhaps been used to evacuate other humans. And so there seems to be a conflict here between prioritizing the rights of humans to flee from the country, to flee from the Taliban, or prioritizing the lives of animals to also be in a safer zone, right? And so we use that to test some of our intuitions, and it's very challenging because there are no straightforward answers, right? But even in this situation, we have to make sure that we don't say, we cannot, because of our framework, we cannot say, oh, of course, humans should be prioritized under all circumstances just because they're humans. We have to give reasons why one set of beings has to be prioritized, because both sets of beings, both humans and non-humans, under a sentience-based constitution, they are considered as inherently valuable, right? So we have to give impartial reasons, let's call them that, impartial reasons that don't have to do with or whether this being is more valuable than the other for making a decision. And some of the impartial, so to speak, but contestable reasons, of course, that we give are that it seems to us that in that particular scenario, let's say that the events as we describe are accurate and they have been disputed, but let's say that they are accurate. Maybe some humans, that plane should have been used for some humans, not because humans should be automatically prioritized, but because the humans were at imminent risk of persecution because of their participation with the regime, right? Because whereas animals and so wouldn't necessarily be persecuted for their participation with the US, right? So that the more imminent threat to life was to humans rather than to animals. Well, of course, all of this is contestable. For example, if there were 100 flights, let's say, as an example, reserved for humans, then why couldn't at least one be reserved for non-human animals, right? But you can see that even though we can dispute, the reasons whether they are strong or non-strong, what we are trying to do is still give, so to speak, impartial reasons that don't necessarily automatically privilege one group of beings over others.
Yeah. And I think it's a really interesting example of how you can have a situation where you are granting equal rights to the entities involved, which for many people will seem like a deeply radical step, but there is absolutely space there for recognizing the particularity of their situations, their interests, the context, the potential consequences, but without slipping into a consequentialist or utilitarian frame. It's still within a equal rights framework, but you can still make proportional differentiation around those decisions to come to a good, to a better choice. So that's a fascinating example. Thank you.
And just to add to that, Jamie, just the reason why we're drawn to this framework too is this is how human rights already works around the world, right? Judges are made, the example, John gave might, seem a bit, exceptional, but really judges are engaging in those kinds of proportionality tests, as they're called, on a daily basis. I'm sure as we're speaking now, there's at least, 20,000 judges doing a proportionality analysis of some case that's before them, where they're maybe looking into, I don't know, the right to freedom of speech of a journalist. Does it override the right to privacy of some celebrity? Those kinds of conflicts in human rights happen all the time. As John mentioned, most human rights are qualified rights, they're relative rights, not absolute rights. So that's another reason why we felt like this is a framework that judges already know how to use. So hopefully quite easily they could apply it, in contexts where animals' rights conflict with human rights too.
Yeah, thank you. And you admit openly that there are going to be some situations where there is no clear answer or there's no good right answer. I mean, no one owes us easy ethics, right? So, yeah.
That's what we need judges for. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So we're still in a sort of reasonably, principled space, I guess. And the next topic you cover in the book, rule of law, takes us from the principle to, much more practical as you talk about the three different, styles of rule of law. And people might immediately jump to this idea of, are we going to see non-human animals in court, in the dock or in the witness stand and so on? But so, what is rule of law? Why is it important? And what's your vision for a sentientist inclusive rule of law?
Yeah, the rule of law is an ideal. It's also a constitutional principle, it's a political idea, and it is contested. One strand of scholarship says that the rule of law really is about enabling government by law, government through law, so that individuals are able to plan their lives, because law has to be clear, has to be prospective. People have to know what their legal rights and legal duties are so that they can plan their lives according to the law and live by law. Government then is subject to the law. And so everyone knows what the rules are and they can decide whether or not to break them.
And they apply to everybody. Yeah.
And they apply to everybody. But there's another strand of scholarship which we think is much more fruitful for the kind of conversation that we are having, which is about, the rule of law is a way to fight against or to prevent arbitrary power, right? Power that is unconstrained, that has no accountability mechanism. And we privilege the second way of thinking because under the first way, the rule of law only protects beings that are able to plan their lives. If the rule of law is only about enabling people to plan, then there are lots of people, including humans, certain humans, that are not able to plan. And so the rule of law gives no benefit, no protection, demands no protection to them, such as, for example, people with severe cognitive disabilities, children, et cetera, et cetera. However, if we change our perspective on what the rule of law is, if it's about preventing arbitrary power, right, without accountability, then of course all sorts of beings are subject to arbitrary power. Not just you and I, let's say, we can speak, can reason, can philosophize, but also non-human animals and humans, such as children or those with severe cognitive disabilities that cannot speak or reason or or go to court. So under this rule of law chapter, what we're trying to do is kind of reorientate our conception of what the rule of law is so that it is more inclusive. And then depending on the kind of rule of law ideal that you subscribe to, it can be more demanding. But on the very minimum, it requires that the law has to clearly authorize intrusive action or violent action towards animals. But on the more demanding side, it requires the animals and their fundamental rights be protected.
Yeah. And it seems like part of the shift you're making is to respond to the fact that initial framing of rule of law, it excludes many beings that shouldn't be excluded. But is it true that it's also a bit sort of value neutral? That you could have some absolutely terrible laws that, as long as they're published and consistently applied, and would it be absolutely fine? Whereas your conception explicitly is including this protection from arbitrary power. There's a protection that's built in where it isn't necessarily hard coded into the sort of more formal abstract version.
Yeah, there as I mentioned, there are different levels of demandingness in your ideas of the rule of law. Some of them just say, yes, the law has to be there. There has to be the law, but the law itself can be totally arbitrary. It can authorize, I don't know, factory farms. But on the other hand, we think that at the very highest level of our ideal of the rule of law is one that the law has to be accountable to justice as well. So on our conception of justice, say factory farms are unjust because they deprive animals, sentient beings, of their fundamental interests. And so if the law is accountable to justice, then we have a very demanding idea of the rule of law, which requires protection of animals in a way that respects their basic interests.
Yeah. So it can't just be rule of any law. It has to be rule of, a just law that's held to account to justice. Yeah.
Yeah. On our preferred conception. Yes.
Now, one of the aspects you talk about is the procedural aspect of rule of law that people are probably familiar with, courts and justice and police forces and investigation and so on. How do you see that procedural process happening in a sentientist rule of law? Will we have non-human animals in the court, or
Well, we already do.
Yeah.
We actually already do. So
yeah.
Raffael was already referring to some of these cases, like Estrelita case in Ecuador, this woolly monkey, and of course the non-human rights projects in the US where chimps, elephants, dolphins, etc., and not literally, but at least symbolically have their day in court because they are represented by lawyers that make arguments that are supposed to defend them. So again, because we are a realistic utopia, we are already basing this procedural account of the rule of law on what is already going on in courts today. And so it's not a too much of a leap to demand that animals, for example, standing, so they're able to sue to be represented in their own name rather than have to show that a harm that is caused to an animal causes indirect harm to a human, and then it's the human that has to go to court. So yeah, this procedural aspect is extremely important in a sentience-based constitution, but is not unprecedented.
Yeah, thank you. There's something to start with already. Yeah? You're building on what's already there. So the final theme you address is that of democracy. And I guess the anthropocentrism is sort of built into the word, and that demos tend to be about, humans. And again, there will be a caricaturish pushback on this in a similar sense of like, are chickens and fishes going to be given the vote, and how is this going to play out? And you have a really nuanced, interesting prescription for what a democratic system might look like under a sentientist constitutional approach. Well, how does that work in your vision? What are the different approaches and themes and challenges within making our democracy sentientist, or maybe a sentiocracy of some sort?
That's nice. I wish I had thought of that term when I was writing the chapter.
Feel free to borrow it.
Maybe for the next edition if there's one. But no, it takes us sort of, full circle, really, Jamie, to our, discussion at the beginning of this conversation about, the demos and our argument that the demos should be interpreted, more inclusively. Because as we said, maybe an hour or so ago, also those who don't get to participate in the making of the rules can still be governed by those rules, right? So we don't want a conception of democracy that is so narrow that it excludes not just animals, but even most human beings who don't actually participate formally in the making of, sort of the rules of the Constitution. So we knew that we wanted to have a broader conception of democracy that allowed us to give due concerns to governed animals. And the way we sort of frame our argument is we say that all governed sentient animals have an equal right to democratic participation, right? An equal right to democratic participation. Now, what does that mean? An equal right to democratic participation doesn't mean that animals have to be treated the same as, say, rational adult human beings. So we're saying it doesn't mean that animals are given formal democratic rights, such as the right to run for office, right? No non-human animal is going to run for president anytime soon under our conception. But the important point here is that that does not mean that you cannot give animals an equal right to democratic participation. You just need to understand democratic participation in a broader sense. So what we do is we draw on some terrific work that's been done by political philosophers like Sue Donaldson, who's written about the way in which animals can indeed be seen and should be seen as political agents, right? In that they are participating in, often certainly for domesticated animals, but some others too, in shared spaces. And we should learn from them to see how their interests should shape those spaces as well. And those are also, if you think maybe of, dogs that are not allowed into a restaurant, for instance, or here in Cambridge, dogs are not allowed into colleges for no clear reason, really. And if there was a dog walking in here, if I came in with my dog here, the mere presence or the sheer presence of my dog here in college will question the norms of this space. And it's a political act, if you will, or we have a wild deer, for instance, that's sort of, questioning, challenging some of those norms. So we agree with the scholarship that says there's something political going on here, but we say that this is politics in an informal sense, right? It is not the running for office type politics. It is not the, voting at the ballot box type politics that we think is reserved to paradigmatic human beings just because of the capacities they have. Maybe at some point in the future could be robots as well, I don't know. But we think that because animals are informal political actors, we need to allow them to participate in the democratic rule-making process in this broader sense. So how does this work concretely? For instance, Sue Donaldson suggests that we should create what she calls microboards. So microboards are basically people who are particularly well placed to know what is in the interest of a given animal or a given set of animals. If you think of, a good sort of owner of, a companion animal, that might be a sort of, microboard to look to. But we can apply to other contexts as well. Maybe animal sanctuaries run by people who really know, a certain group of animals really well. They've known them for years. They know exactly, what these animals want. And going beyond that, why do we focus on participation? We think that purely from an epistemic point of view, to know what is in the interest in the animal. It is very easy to think, what is in the interest of an animal, but you don't really, because, we're human beings. At the end of the day, we see through our human eyes and, think through our human brains, and we anthropomorphize whether we want it or not. And that can be problematic for animals too. So the participation element puts a focus on giving animals a choice as well, right? And there are so-called choice tests that you can do with animals where you present them with a whole range of different choices. And you give the animals an agency to decide what they want, telling you maybe something you didn't even anticipate, right? So we think this is all crucial. And at the sort of sort of end of the chapter, we sketch what kinds of actual sort of formal institutions would need to be created to give due concern to animals in this democratic sense. So we argue that there should be a certain quota of sentient beings representatives, right? So they're basically people sitting in parliament, a certain number of seats reserved for representatives of animals. And I'd be happy to go into sort of the election mechanism and all of that as well if there's interest. But in addition to that, in addition to representative democracy, we think that animals should also have a more direct, say, a direct democratic, sort of way in which they can participate. And that takes us back to, ancient Athens, if you will, where we think that certain representatives of animals should be able to bring, what's sometimes called a popular initiative or a ballot initiative to create laws that are in their interest, or to veto laws that are being proposed in parliament and that are not in their interest. So we think that animals should be allowed to participate both indirectly through representatives in parliament, but also directly through having representatives that are, able to bring more direct proposals that would be in their interest. So that's roughly how we think an equal right to democratic participation would work.
Yeah, thank you. So that concept of political participation is broadened out to acknowledge that, the yelp of a puppy or a cow resisting being dragged into a slaughterhouse, or a wild animal following its migration pattern, or an animal following a choice test where it, in an embodied way, expresses a preference. Those are political expressions. Those can be reflected through representatives, hopefully acting in good faith with the right checks and balances around, but even through direct processes as well. It's a fascinating combination of processes, and I'd encourage people to dig into the book, because you get some quite specific ideas about how that could actually work and how it could play through. And I think many people, there might be an initial sticker shock where they think, hold on, this just can't fit. But I think you make it very clear that it can, and you can draw analogies to children's representation within the political process. I think Wales, as an example, has a minister who represents future generations. They're already, again, in this, realistic utopia approach, the seeds of the ideas about how we actually might be able to turn this into practice. Yeah, thank you. Now, this is an unfair question to ask, because I think the point of what you're talking about here is not for, John and Raffael to say, here's our utopian vision. It's to say, here's a sentientist constitutionalism, and then that, and in the democracy process, the sentiocracy would then decide what to do and where to go forward. But to ask the unfair question anyway, if you pressed a button now and imagined that states around the world actually moved towards this sentientist constitutional approach, and it had time to bed in and roll through, and the assemblies were in place, and the representatives were in place, and we worked through some of the representative options and the direct options as well, what are the biggest changes you think we'd see in our world practically as a result?
Should I make a start, John? So it's a massive question, obviously, so I'm not going to be able to do it justice. But so certainly what is going to change is the main ways in which we currently exploit animals are going to disappear straight away with the push of that button, right? So say goodbye to factory farms, say goodbye to, sort of animal use for, sort of production of medication, animals used for entertainment, at least in sort of most scenarios, I'm sure. So all of this is going to disappear. And I think more broadly, what you would see is the sort of addressing of problems that we're grappling with at the moment and can't really quite, sort of manage to find a solution to. Say, we mentioned the climate crisis earlier. The climate crisis is many things, but it is also, a major way of ignoring the interest of, billions of sentient animals, right? So if we, to take your point about, once the sentient democracy, sort of is operating, what kinds of decisions would be made, I'm sure there would be decisions that would try to, rein in the use of fossil fuels massively, if not, completely. So I could see sort of the world changing in many positive ways that we haven't quite managed to do because we've been so focused only on, our own human interests, which too, of course, are being affected by climate change, but maybe not enough for us to, really be doing something. So hopefully it will be a way of solving many of our other problems as well.
Yeah, thank you. Might even be good for us humans.
There you go.
But again, just to add to Raffael, and thank you, Raffael, for taking that hard question that you volunteered to take. No, more fundamentally, our relationship with other animals would have changed if we press this button, because we will go from a huge paradigm. Perhaps that's what currently animals are. They are instruments for us to use. Okay, and that's how they're considered. To a co-citizen or co-subject or co-fellow earthling paradigm. So of course, perhaps this will then directly result in us being able to address some of the environmental catastrophe that we are currently experiencing. But I see that more as a side effect. I see it, the main effect is really to move us towards a more legitimate political order, especially when it comes to constitutionalism, which is the focus of our book. That we see we are closing that legitimacy gap that it's so wide in existing constitutions. We don't say that no constitution is totally illegitimate nowadays, and that we should all go and act in a revolutionary way. That's not what we are saying. But we're saying that, in fact, our reasons to pay allegiance to our constitutional orders is weaker than many of us acknowledge, right? Because there are so many people, and I use people intentionally, that are excluded, right? And not just animals, right? Also human beings that are unjustly excluded by some of the way in which we are thinking through constitutionalism today and some of our practices. So that if we push that button, that imaginary button, and went into a sentience-based constitution tomorrow, then we will have a legal system or a constitutional system that really would be worth fighting for, as we say in the very conclusion and introduction of the book.
Yeah, thank you. Another really tough question to ask, and I know we're running out of time here, so I'm going to ask you two more really tough questions. How do these ideas relate to modern conceptions of intrahuman politics? So you might think about different modes of economic organization, state-based to market-based. You might think about different political philosophies, centralization, subsidiarization, modes of organization. You might think of, cultural conservatism and social conservatism, these sort of different dimensions that run through politics today, often in a very brutally polarized ways. How do your ideas relate to that space? Are they orthogonal, or how do they plug in? A tough question.
I'm going to volunteer John for this one.
I think our project is both conservative and progressive from a, ideological viewpoint. Progressive because, of course, what we're trying to do is to extend the legitimacy of constitutional orders to more beings than are currently being imagined. So in this sense, is a deeply progressive word. And in fact, based on what Raffael said in his last answer, and many of the ways in which we use animals would need to be abolished, right? So in a sense, this project is really revolutionary. I wouldn't say anti-capitalist, but definitely anti-status quo, right? But on the other hand, we're trying to be, and maybe this is just the side effect of being lawyers and being schooled in a conservative environment, which law schools tend to be, especially the law schools we have been to, in a sense.
Small c.
The conservative, yes, of course, with a small c, is that we still want to take liberalism seriously. We still want to take existing legal practice. And so we base our progressive future in the now, in the current practices, in the current ideas. So I'm not sure whether that answers your questions, but I can see that really in terms of social movements, we are trying to straddle to sometimes opposing viewpoints.
Yeah, I think it was a good politician's answer. No, I think it's a genuine answer. Thank you.
Yeah,
I don't know if you wanted to add to that, Raffael. I'll just leave it to
what he said.
Yeah, perfect. So the final tough question, we really are running short on time. How do we make all this happen? You have this idea of building on, ways of doing things and institutions and principles already. So there is that sort of incrementalism built in. Is it something you see maybe more, a top-down thing where you could see changes being made at UN level or regional level or national level, or, could there be experimentation at bottom up that operates at different points? Yeah, how do you think this might actually shift in this direction? You can answer that however you like.
In short, I think it's all of the above, right? Which is to say, it's going to take a whole range of different approaches that we're going to have to sort of work simultaneously alongside one another. Now, that's not to say that there's potentially not better and worse approaches, and it would be good. And in fact, there isn't enough, I think, research being done into what actually moves people. Right. There's some, but I know that in the animal space, there's a bit of a gap here. We all have our ideas and, this feels right. So therefore I'm, pursuing this approach. But have we actually done some empirical research on this? Does this actually, ring true with the kind of target audiences we have? So more of this should be done, I think. But still, and maybe this needs an empirical, verification too. But it seems right to me to say that we need a whole range of different approaches. And usually people working on the ground are more familiar with their environments, not least because perhaps also they have the expertise to do X rather than Y. So they're doing X, seeing how that goes. And then maybe someone in another country does maybe the more top-down approach, that you mentioned, Jamie. So in short, I think it's going to take a whole variety of different approaches. And personally, I haven't seen too many approaches that are obviously wrong. Although that said, I obviously favor the more rights-based approaches versus the welfarist approaches. But even there's arguments saying, well, welfare can be coined a right at the end of the day in a very thin sense. So maybe as long as we pile up a lot of these small, thin rights, maybe we'll get to something a bit more robust after some time. Again, just the empirics aren't there to prove that, wrong or right either way.
And I think it's obvious where some of the resistance will come from, politically, corporates, entrenched interests, culturally. But what do you think publics around the world will think of these ideas in general? What sort of reception do you think you'll get from the public at large? Will there be a conservative backlash, or is this tapping into a sort of latent compassion that people already feel for non-human sentient beings, and the ideas would be welcome? Do you have a sense? Again, it's an impossible question to answer, but how optimistic are you about the public reaction?
It's an impossible question. And Raffael and I, in some way, we have been engaged in this endeavor to think through these issues with a more compassionate word, a more just word. I prefer to say it for us and other species. But also we have to be mindful that we have to operate within our own expertise. So Raffael and I are academics, and I can talk about the reception we have in the academic world, which is so far positive. We have done a few discussions of the book, and people that respond who are mostly academics seem to be challenged, but being generally agreeable. We cannot talk about the public at large because we haven't gone to the outside universities yet. Of course, Jamie, this episode will help.
Yeah, my massive audience.
Bridge some of that gap. And so, but we want to use our own expertise, right, to make the change that we can make. And there were others that will use their own expertise, whether it's direct action, that are talking to people on the street, or politicians, or courts, deciding cases in a way that aligns with sentience-based constitutionalism.
Brilliant. Thank you. Another impossible question to ask. Well, I'm going to let you go, but thank you so much. I think it's a deeply important intervention. Like you said, it's realistic utopia, but it's also deeply radical and I think deeply just as well. So thank you so much. What's the best way of people buying the book, following you guys, whatever online work you do? Or I will include links in the show notes, of course, but, is there a particular place you'd like to point people?
There's a discount code for the book, so that'll take 30% off the price, and we can send that to you, Jamie, and you can put it in the description.
Great, thanks.
And I'm on Blue Sky, Raffael, Fasel, and people can follow me there.
How about you, John?
People can email me at my Queen Mary address. That's the best place to get in touch with me.
Yeah, that's great. Brilliant. Well, thank you again so much, Raffael. I'd look forward to having you back on for a sort of classic Sentientism conversation at some point, but it's been brilliant to explore this deeply important book with you. Thank you so much for being guests on Sentientist Conversations.
Thank you so much, Jamie, for having us. This was an amazing conversation. Really enjoyed it.
Take care. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye now.